Jane, are we beginning to push against the bottom of where you see the dollar going, or do you see significantly more downside here?
Well, I mean, you're right. There's been quite a lot of volatility today, and I think it's really worth asking that question. I think the majority view, the consensus view, and of course that's a dangerous thing sometimes to have, is that the dollar can weaken quite a lot further. And if we go back to fundamentals, we can look at things like real interest rates. That was something that really undermined the dollar last year, and I think the same fundamentals are true. There's a big school of thought worrying about inflation on the rise. We've seen that in gold prices as well recently, and that could undermine the dollar. However, again, if we look at the news today with respect to the pandemic, well, there is some worrying stuff there. And I think the market has got to come to terms with the fact that, at least from an economic perspective and from a health perspective, things could get a lot worse before they get better, before we see the vaccine rollout program really take a hold in our population. So from that point of view, that there is still the risk that you could have some pullbacks, that the dollar could strengthen on a drop of risk appetite. And of course, there's US politics too, that the same is there too. You could see the dollar benefiting from some decline in risk appetite related to that too. So there's still lots of factors there which could disturb this consensus view of a weaker dollar.
Well, and then to that point, what I noticed today was we had that weaker dollar, right? You have break-evens rising, you have real yields getting more negative, and then at the same time you get this PMI number that comes in a quarter to 10. We usually don't really pay that much attention to that number. It's pretty strong, and all of a sudden the dollar reverses. So I wonder if the narrative of maybe the U.S. can grow faster out of it if their rollout is more successful than Europe's, for example. Is that a thing now in the market?
I think that's going to be talked about certainly as we move on towards this year. I think if we go back to last year, if we look at the indications that we've had from the Fed talking about no interest rate hike till 2023, no inflation at target till 2023, well, the market's beginning to really dispute that. If you look at where the market is looking for inflation, it's expecting 2% inflation, perhaps a lot sooner than the Fed is thinking. We had, of course, some commentaries, for instance, one last month from Dudley, again, warning about inflation coming through into the US economy faster than the market's expecting. So if and when we get to the position where the market's expecting the Fed to really perhaps go back on its expectations that there won't be 2% inflation until 2023, if the Fed starts to indicate that it could come sooner, if the market starts to think about higher nominal interest rates in the US, I think at that point, yes, the dollar will turn. But we don't know exactly when that could be. Could it be the end of this year? Could it be next year? I think we'll have to wait and see.
Could it come tomorrow? If the Dems win in Georgia and we get massive stimulus from the Biden team, could that be the turning point?
Well, again, I mean, that certainly would be something that the market would really have to consider. More fiscal stimulus. Again, could that be something that could bring a lot of inflation? Well, perhaps it could bring a little bit more inflation. But I think as far as tomorrow is concerned, in fact, as far as the whole of this quarter is concerned, I think we're going to be pressing against the bad news from restrictions and hospitalizations with respect to COVID. So I think for Q1, probably Q2, we've got a lot of bad news on the economic front to get through first. And I think that will keep on quashing some of the optimism out there about the US recovery and the recovery elsewhere. But I think once we get to perhaps towards the middle of the year, I think things could begin to start changing.
What about then where we have seen the recovery take hold in a positive light, and that obviously is China and emerging Asia, South Korea even, their exports coming in pretty solidly. How much more upside is there to those currencies?
Well, again, I think right now the market thinks that there's perhaps quite a bit more. And again, that's a consensus view, which could be dangerous. But if we look at the data coming through from China, really through large parts of last year, it was better. It does suggest, of course, that China had a better hold of the pandemic. In fact, if you look throughout the whole of the Asian region, a better hold of the pandemic. And yes, the Japanese government could be announcing a new state of emergency in Tokyo and 3 areas around Tokyo. But even their numbers are far lower than the numbers that you've seen through Europe and through the US. So the investor base is of the view that Asia perhaps is going to benefit during Q1, Q2, as Europe and the US continue to suffer from restrictions. But again, perhaps that will fade as we move into the second half of the year.
Jane, Europe The EU is rolling out its vaccine program really slowly. It's behind, way behind. Why is that not euro negative?
Well, why is it not euro negative yet? This is something perhaps that the market was only really aware of today, looking at those numbers from Germany and, of course, particularly France. And you had your reporter talking about this just a little while ago. We know that in France that there's a lot of administration, that all the patients have to be consulted for before they have the injection. That takes a lot of time. We know that there's a big anti-vaxxer campaign there. Again, that pushes against France's rollout. But I think at some point, when you're looking at the million or so people already vaccinated in the UK, at the 4 million or so in the US, at some point, if Europe does not accelerate these vaccines, then you will probably have the euro really reacting negatively to this story, because it pushes back the recovery story even further.